And that's the BBC News at 3 minutes past 12.
Vanessa Feltz. Listen live on the BBC Sounds app. BBC Radio 2.
Hello, this is Vanessa Feltz sitting in for Jeremy Vine on the programme this lunchtime. Travel companies say expensive mandatory COVID tests could make foreign holidays this summer the preserve of the wealthy. But is that tough luck? Is it fair to say if you want to go abroad, you need to pay the price? A group of MPs say that body mass index as a measure of obesity should be scrapped because it inspires weight stigma. Did you feel shamed by your BMI? How difficult is it when you disagree with your partner over how to parent your child? For example, they're very strict and you are not. And do the flowers that you leave at a cemetery graveside keep getting eaten by rabbits? Please email your comment to vine@bbc.co.uk and include your name and phone number, or text your point to 88291.
BBC Radio 2.
Pat Benatar, love is a battlefield. This morning, the government said foreign summer holidays are back on the cards. Just like last year, there'll be an official traffic light system. Low-risk countries will be green, those on the watch list amber, and places with high rates of coronavirus will be red. Ministers are expected to allow quarantine-free travel from the 17th of May to a small number of green-listed countries, most likely Israel, Gibraltar, Greece and Malta. However, while would-be holidaymakers are celebrating, one element of the plan causing controversy is the cost of the testing system. All passengers will have to take COVID tests before leaving and on returning, even from green countries. Only the more accurate PCR tests will be accepted on return, and at over £120 each, they're not cheap. As an example, a return trip to Greece currently requires 5 tests overall. That's £370 per person, nearly £1,500 for a family of 4. The travel industry says this will mean only wealthy people will be able to afford to fly. It'll certainly make things even more difficult for those wanting to reunite with family abroad, for example. Earlier, the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, said he wants to cut the cost of COVID tests.
We want to see these tests be as cheap and convenient as possible. And I'm going to work with the travel industry and the private testing providers to drive down that cost. I won't spare those companies that seem to be profiteering, including potentially removing them from the recommended list.
However, critics ask why the government is considering subsidising foreign holidays during a global pandemic. They argue that if you can afford flights, accommodation and a beer on the beach, you need to suck it up and pay for a test to keep everyone back home as safe as possible. So give us your view on this. You can email vine@bbc.co.uk with your phone number or text us on 88229.
This is BBC News. We're interrupting our schedules for the following announcement. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh. A statement from Buckingham Palace said, "It is with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen has announced the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His Royal Highness passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle." Buckingham Palace has announced the death of His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh. A statement from Buckingham Palace said, "It is with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen has announced the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His Royal Highness passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle."
Tom Sandars. It's 12 minutes past 12. This is Evan Davis. You're listening to BBC News, broadcasting a special programme across all BBC radio networks following the announcement of the death of His Royal Highness, the Duke of Edinburgh. I am joined by BBC Royal Correspondent Johnny Diamond. Johnny, this is news of enormous significance for Britain and the royal family.
It is. It is enormously significant, as you say, for the country and for the family. But of course, it is of most significance to the Queen. And the statement from Buckingham Palace made that very clear. The reference to Prince Philip as the Queen's beloved husband and of the Queen's deep sorrow. She is a woman who does not go out of her way to speak in great emotion, but she made very clear, 20 or so years ago, on her golden wedding, how much she had lent upon Prince Philip in the many, many decades of her service and his service, saying that he was her strength and stay. And so many people's thoughts will be with the Queen now, and of course with the children and the grandchildren, who will now presumably be making their way towards London as soon as they will be able to, and to Windsor. But also a time for reflection on long, long decades of service that Prince Philip gave the country, from the marriage to the Queen in 1947, her accession, of course, to the throne, and then the long, long times and the long periods he spent at her side and also away from her, carrying out duties on behalf of the Crown. So a sad day, obviously, for his family, but also for the nation that he served for so long.
Obviously, Johnny had been in hospital for quite an extended period, perhaps determined to get home from hospital.
Certainly. He went into hospital in mid-February, and I think there was surprise as that period went on at how long he spent there. And it was clear that his health was not as it had once been. He spent a life of incredible vigour, incredible dynamism, marked only really, I suppose, in the last 10 or so years with visits to hospital. He had a heart condition, which we understand was dealt with in hospital this time around. There were problems also with a bladder condition that he had for some years. But most of his life was marked, as I say, with an energy which surprised onlookers, an energy which, even in his 70s, was remarked upon by one biographer as if he was having a second youth. But in the end, as it does with all of us, time did weary him. He retired from public life a few years ago. We barely saw him apart from those excursions to hospital. And then there was one last public appearance last year as he handed over his final honorary command, a brief public appearance at Windsor Castle. And then really the last we saw of him was as he was driven from hospital around mid-March this year. The hopes of many would have been, of course, that he would live for some time after that. But it seems that the illness did finally take him, and that aged 99, he has left us.
Age 99. To think the first member of the royal family to travel in a helicopter, so much has happened over his long life. You're listening to BBC News. We are interrupting BBC schedules for the announcement of the death of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. I will just repeat the statement from the palace. It is with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen announces the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness, the Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. His Royal Highness passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle. Further announcements will be made in due course. The royal family join with people around the world in mourning his loss. Well, he was the consort for 73 years. He married Princess Elizabeth in 1947, the 20th of November, the first male partner for a British head of state since Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, obviously had a unique role in British life and will be remembered for that commitment to charities, the Duke of Edinburgh scheme, the award scheme, his advocacy for conservation and the environment. Perhaps surprisingly, given he once claimed that in a constitutional sense he simply didn't exist, he did play an important role in modernising the royal family and making them accessible to the public while helping to steer the monarchy through a period of enormous change. And he will, of course, also be remembered for that direct way of speaking and the occasional gaffe. When he himself was asked about his contribution to public life, he answered in a typically forthright style.
I've just done what I think is my best. I mean, some people think it was all right. Other people quite evidently don't. What can you do? I can't suddenly change my whole way of doing things. I can't change my interests. I can't change the way in which I react to things. That's part of that's somebody's style, and I'm just too bad. You've got to lump it.
The Duke, in his own words. Robert Hardman is a royal biographer, documentary maker. He toured Windsor Castle with Prince Philip for the BBC One series, The Queen's Castle. Robert, thank you for joining us. You've obviously had extensive access to the royals. Maybe you can reflect on the character, the person that he was, Prince Philip.
Well, thank you. Yes, like everyone, I'm extremely sad to hear this news. We are really reflecting on, as Johnny has mentioned, a consort for 73 years. I mean, this has been not just a marriage, but a partnership. It's been the longest royal marriage in history. And I think millions of people around the world really owe a great deal to the Duke, not just here in this country. This is the man who created the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme that took off in Britain, but has now been embraced by millions of young people in over 120 countries. This is a man who really led the way in conservation, helping to found the World Wildlife Fund, which then spun off into organisations like Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth. I mean, the environmentalists around the world owe a lot to this man. He's done a great deal, obviously, to bring the monarchy into the modern era. The Queen herself has paid tribute to all that he's done in that regard. And there is now a very, very large hole in not just in royal life, but in our national life as well.
Right. Just to recap, this is BBC News broadcasting across radio networks, BBC radio networks, as we report the announcement in the last 15 minutes of the death of His Royal Highness, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Robert Hardman, reflect, if you would, on what it means for the Queen, now Queen for the first time, without the Duke by her side.
I mean, I think everyone's heart will be going out to the Queen. She has been our longest serving monarch. She's between them. They were this formidable partnership, and they have broken almost every record in the royal record books. And over the years, I've been lucky enough to see them on tour together, at events together, and it's always so clear that so much of what she's done, what she's achieved, has been because she's had the man she called her strength and stay at her side, and all the family will now, of course, be rallying round, but
sure.
She is this very great world figure, and we all feel for her. And I think today the whole world will be their first thoughts will be for her. But we'll just reflect with immense, I think, affection. I mean, you look back on the life of the Duke; it's so multifaceted. From here's a man who was playing cricket at international level, who represented his country on the polo field, who ran world equestrian sport for 25 years. I mean, this is quite apart from all his many
also,
other
Robert,
achievements.
Whatever anybody's view of the institution of monarchy, I mean, tend to feel that the Queen and Duke, we kind of almost know them personally, don't we? An absolute fixture of national life. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that in the same way that the world would come to say Victoria and Albert as a phrase. I mean, Elizabeth and Philip, they have just been central to the life of this country in so many ways that we possibly haven't appreciated, but I'm sure we will as you know, in the
Well, over
days
the
to come.
next hours and days. Robert, thank you for that. Now, I can tell you that we are expecting the Prime Minister to give a statement shortly. I'm presuming that will be on camera, and we will take that. But Johnny Diamond, BBC Royal Correspondent, still with me. And Johnny, we are now getting some reaction to the death of the Duke.
Yes, we're getting some words now from Keir Starmer, obviously the Labour leader. He said the United Kingdom has lost an extraordinary public servant in Prince Philip. Prince Philip dedicated his life to our country, from a distinguished career in the Royal Navy during the Second World War to his decades of service as the Duke of Edinburgh. However, he will be remembered most of all for his extraordinary commitment and devotion to the Queen. For more than 7 decades, Keir Starmer says, he has been at her side. Their marriage has been a symbol of strength, stability and hope, even as the world around them changed. Most recently, during the pandemic, it was a partnership that inspired millions in Britain and beyond. My thoughts, says Sir Keir, are with the Queen, the royal family and the British people as our nation comes together to mourn and remember the life of Prince Philip.
Prince Philip, born on the island of Corfu in 1921, a prince of Greece, although descended from Queen Victoria. His family forced into exile from Greece in the upheaval in the Balkans following the First World War. All this brings home to you just the leap in the ages from which he was born to that in which he's died. And the infant prince was carried onto a British naval ship in a makeshift cot from an orange box.
I was a refugee, and I left Greece when I was 1. And at that time, they then had a republic. And so we, in fact, travelled on Danish passports because the other branch of the family very kindly provided us. Otherwise, we would have been stateless.
Prince Philip's childhood was difficult. His parents split up. He was looked after by relatives. He attended school in Germany for a time. But his inspirational headmaster, Kurt Hahn, was a German Jew, and Germany was under Nazi rule. The headmaster and his young pupil moved to Gordonston School in Scotland. It was Hahn who, in fact, inspired the Duke of Edinburgh Award, which the Duke saw as his greatest achievement.
Well, it started with Kurt Hahn, who was the headmaster of Gordonston, and he came to me more or less out of the blue because I'd rather lost touch with him. And he said, "My boy, I want you to start the award scheme." And so I said, "Yes, sir." He felt very strongly that in the modern world, in the sense you with so many young people living in cities and being so constrained by the structure of school and qualification and occupation and profession and so on, that they never really had a chance to develop all the other sides of human activities and to have, in a sense, what nowadays I think one would describe as the right brain activities.
Prince Philip talking about his childhood. Just a reminder, you're listening to BBC News. We've interrupted schedules across BBC Radio to report the announcement of the death of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. I'm Evan Davis. Robert Hardman, still on the line. Robert, we've heard a little bit about his childhood there, but in many ways, quite a difficult family background.
Yes, I mean there is someone who born in one country, as you say, was a refugee, escaped on a British warship, spent his early years in exile in France. His parents separated when he was quite young. He was the youngest of 5. All his elder sisters were married while he was still before he was even a teenager, and he just had this sort of peripatetic life. He was at school in this country, relatives scattered around Europe, and then he was very close to his uncle Lord Mountbatten, who was a very strong influence in his life, and he joined the Royal Navy just before the start of the Second World War, and was soon in the thick of the action with his entire family effectively on the other side. His parents were in occupied Europe. His brothers-in-law were all fighting for the enemy, and here you had this this figure who really has, you know, he's just lived this extraordinary life, and so much of it has been down to the dynamism that Johnny Diamond mentioned earlier, to that ability to face up to extraordinary odds. I mean, his childhood, really, we look back at it today. I mean, if he'd grown up in those circumstances today, people would have been very worried about him, but he's just always had this inner strength, and his wartime record shows that. His career in the Royal Navy immediately after the war, he was one of the most talented young officers of his generation. He'd unquestionably have risen to the very top of the Royal Navy had it not been, had he not married Princess Elizabeth and had the King not died at an early age. So, he's been part of our national life in so many ways, and to try and capture the breadth, the range of his achievements, it's going to take us, I think, a long time to appreciate it all.
Robert, let me interrupt you there, if I may, because Prime Minister has stepped into Downing Street in front of the door of number 10, and we can hear his words at this time.
It was with great sadness that a short time ago I received word from Buckingham Palace that His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh has passed away at the age of 99. Prince Philip earned the affection of generations here in the United Kingdom, across the Commonwealth and around the world. He was the longest serving consort in history, one of the last surviving people in this country to have served in the Second World War, at Cape Matapan, where he was mentioned in dispatches for bravery, and in the invasion of Sicily, where he saved his ship by his quick thinking. And from that conflict, he took an ethic of service that he applied throughout the unprecedented changes of the post-war era. Like the expert carriage driver that he was, he helped to steer the royal family and the monarchy so that it remains an institution indisputably vital to the balance and happiness of our national life. He was an environmentalist and a champion of the natural world, long before it was fashionable. With his Duke of Edinburgh award scheme, he shaped and inspired the lives of countless young people, and at literally tens of thousands of events, he fostered their hopes and encouraged their ambitions. We remember the Duke for all of this, and above all, for his steadfast support for Her Majesty the Queen. Not just as her consort, by her side every day of her reign, but as her husband, her strength and stay of more than 70 years. And it is to Her Majesty and her family that our nation's thoughts must turn today, because they have lost not just a much-loved and highly respected public figure, but a devoted husband and a proud and loving father, grandfather, and in recent years, great-grandfather. Speaking on their golden wedding anniversary, Her Majesty said that our country owed her husband a greater debt than he would ever claim or we shall ever know. And I'm sure that estimate is correct. So we mourn today with Her Majesty the Queen. We offer our condolences to her and to all her family. And we give thanks as a nation and a kingdom for the extraordinary life and work of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh.
Prime Minister there speaking in Downing Street. If you are just joining us, this is BBC News as we report the death of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. The Prime Minister there, in his words, talking about the ethic of service that the Duke has subscribed to over his life, giving a short obituary of the Prince, really, talking about his history, both his military history and his life of service in the royal family. I'm Evan Davis. I'm joined by Mishal Husain, and the time now is 31 minutes past 12.
And we are all reflecting on this news that the Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, has died at the age of 99. It is an immense personal loss, of course, to Her Majesty the Queen, but also the loss of someone who has been part of our national life over decades. He had a marriage of 73 years to the Queen. And Andrew Marr is on the line now, amongst Andrew's books, History of Modern Britain and also the Diamond Queen series. It is that combination, Andrew, of a personal loss for the royal family, but also someone who has been at the heart of our national life.
Absolutely. You have to realise this story really starts in July 1939, when he was 18 and the Queen was all of 13. It was the first time she saw him. They were at a royal review at Spithead, Dartmouth rather. She was there with her father and she saw him. He had been told by his commanding officers to look after the princesses. And really, she hasn't taken her eyes off him ever since. They were married in 1947, the first really big royal wedding in modern times, overseen by television, the first televised royal wedding. And he has really been at her side every year, every month, ever since. He's done a few tours by himself, but he has been somebody without whom she could not have been as successful a queen as she has been.
Shall we contrast, Andrew, those early years when they did have as close to possible in the circumstances of a married life before her father died and she became queen?
That's right. Well, he was a serving naval officer. Of course, he'd had a very, very gallant service during the war. He'd saved his ship on one occasion by using decoyed burning rafts. He'd been at the Battle of Cape Matapan, where the Royal Navy defeated an Italian force. A very successful naval officer who, had he not married the Queen, might well have ended up leading the Navy. But they had a fantastic time together on Malta before she became Queen, where they had something quite close, a real ordinary life together, going to parties, dancing, playing polo. She became very keen on filming him. She was an amateur photographer of some talent at the time, and they had that lovely period away from the press, away from the eyes of the world, before they actually settled down to being Prince Philip and the Queen in London.
And it was he who broke the news to her that her father had died and that therefore she was now the Queen. It
absolutely was. They were on holiday in Kenya at the beginning of what was going to be a long royal tour because her father was too ill to do it. And he was phoned from London and told what had happened. He broke the news to her, and that must have been an absolutely extraordinary moment because she went from being essentially a private princess, enjoying her life, to being a queen at a very, very young age. They flew back. She was in tears during the flight. She walked down the steps of the aircraft at Heathrow Airport, London Airport as it then was greeted by Churchill, other members of the cabinet, and her life changed forever, as did his. He was not a man who enjoyed publicity, and yet he would live the rest of his life being stared at, photographed, commented upon, eavesdropped on, and he never really came to terms with that, I think.
And we know that from various things that he did say over the years, all the various things that he then did turn his attention to, his projects, his charitable activities, his passions.
Well, he started off as a constant reformer. He wanted to change royal protocol. He was impatient at the kind of fusty Victorian habits of the then court. The older courtiers didn't take to him very easily, and it was quite difficult. And he was involved in all sorts of reforms, not just of the monarchy, but also he wanted to reform British industry. He made many, many important speeches during the 1950s and 60s, railing at the incompetence, the lethargy and the sloth of British business and industry. Again, didn't make him very popular. And of course, he launched all his personal initiatives, the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme being the most famous of them, which really came from one of his great advisors, who was Kurt Hahn, the great a German Jewish educationalist who established Gordonston, the Scottish school where he was at school, and who inspired in him a belief in the outdoor life, in lots of hard work, physical effort, and that for every child being an important thing in growing up. He applied it to his own children with mixed success, but he also introduced generations of British and overseas children to an outdoors and ambitious way of life, perhaps that they wouldn't have known without him.
How would you characterise his influence on the way that the monarchy and the royal family really have changed over the years with different kinds of press attention. What has been his preferred form of the balance between openness and privacy?
Well, that's a complicated question, Mishal. On the one hand, he has been a reformer. He was enthusiastic about some of the earlier attempts to open up the royal family. There's a famous BBC film about the royal family made in colour in the 1960s, which was regarded as being an extraordinary moment for the royals at the time, and he was in favour of that. But it has to be said, he did not have the easiest relationship with the British press, completely, in particular the tabloid press. He talked about them in pretty unflattering terms and never changed his mind about that. I think he found the prurience and the prying, as he would see it, of the media extremely difficult, and he would have been a great support to his children and in particular recently his grandchildren when they went through the same kind of thing. He believed that essentially private life was private life and it was nobody else's business. And at the same time, he understood that the royal family had to be in the public eye. As the Queen has often said, I have to be seen to be believed. And he understood that. So he played his part in endless parades and public occasions and was always gracious and smiling, whatever he was thinking behind those gritted teeth.
Andrew Marr, thank you.
Can tell you that the Union Jack is at half-mast now over Buckingham Palace in tribute to Prince Philip, and the royal family's official website has switched to a holding page in memory of the Duke. It features a central image of Philip on a black background accompanied by the palace's statement. You're listening to BBC News. It's 22 minutes to 1, and at this point we'll go to Tom Sandars for a short summary of the news.
Buckingham Palace has announced that the Duke of Edinburgh has died. Prince Philip, who is 99, was the longest-serving consort in British history. The Duke and the Queen were married for more than 70 years, and Prince Philip dedicated decades of his life to royal duty, serving the nation at the monarch's side. He retired from public engagements in the summer of 2017. In a statement, the palace said, "It is with deep sorrow that Her Majesty the Queen announces the death of her beloved husband, His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. His Royal Highness passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle. Further announcements will be made in due course. The royal family join with people around the world in mourning his loss." The Duke had returned to Windsor Castle on March the 16th after spending a month in hospital, his longest ever stay. He initially received care for an infection, but then underwent heart surgery for a pre-existing condition. The father of the Prince of Wales, the Princess Royal, the Duke of York and the Earl of Wessex was just 2 months away from his 100th birthday in June. He spent much of the COVID-19 crisis staying with the Queen at Windsor in HMS Bubble, the nickname given to the couple's reduced household of devoted staff during lockdown. Speaking at Downing Street a short time ago, the Prime Minister said that the Duke had helped steer the royal family and the monarchy so it remains an institution vital to the balance of our national life.
We remember the Duke for his steadfast support for Her Majesty the Queen. Not just as her consort, by her side every day of her reign, but as her husband, her strength and stay of more than 70 years. And it is to Her Majesty and her family that our nation's thoughts must turn today, because they have lost not just a much-loved and highly respected public figure, but a devoted husband and a proud and loving father, grandfather, and in recent years, great-grandfather.
The royal author Robert Hardman says the long partnership between the Queen and Prince Philip will go down in history as comparable to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert.
You know, everyone's heart will be going out to the Queen. She has been our longest serving monarch. She's between them. They were this formidable partnership, and they have broken almost every record in the royal record books.
The leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer, has paid this tribute. The United Kingdom has lost an extraordinary public servant in Prince Philip. Prince Philip dedicated his life to our country, from a distinguished career in the Royal Navy during the Second World War to his decades of service as the Duke of Edinburgh. However, he'll be remembered most of all for his extraordinary commitment and devotion to the Queen. For more than 7 decades, he's been at her side. Their marriage has been a symbol of strength, stability and hope, even as the world around them changed, most recently during the pandemic. It was a partnership that inspired millions in Britain and beyond.
Thank you, Tom. Well, let's explore more the statements that we've had so far, the response, the tributes after the news of the death of His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh. Johnny Diamond, our royal correspondent, is here. The Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, other political leaders issuing statements in the last few minutes.
That's right, Mishal. We heard earlier just now from the Prime Minister and his contribution of how Philip, in his words, helped steer the royal family and the monarchy, so it remains an institution indisputably vital to the balance and happiness of our national life, but also from Sir Keir Starmer, from the leader of the Labour Party, who described Prince Philip as an extraordinary public servant who dedicated his life to our country, and who will be remembered most of all for his extraordinary commitment and devotion to the Queen. A long statement from the Archbishop of Canterbury as well, a personal note from the Archbishop in part of his statement. On the occasions when I met him, said the Archbishop, I was always struck by his obvious joy at life, his inquiring mind and his ability to communicate to people from every background and walk of life. He was a master of putting people at their ease and making them feel special. The legacy, says the Archbishop, he leaves is enormous. I pray that God will comfort Her Majesty and the rest of the royal family at this time. May His Royal Highness rest in peace and rise in glory.
And it is a vast personal loss for her after such a long marriage. They had their 73rd wedding anniversary last November.
I know, it's a breathtaking span of time, taking in, well, it starts really in the grips of austerity, post-war Britain, 1947. A wedding which was described then by Churchill as a bolt of colour on the hard road that we travel, so difficult with the times. And then taking in the dissolution of empire, the entry and then the exit of this country from the European Union, all the changes that this country saw. And overseen by the Duke, but also, as Robert Hardman said, the Duke was an active participant, ahead of his time in so many ways, whether it was championing industrial design, whether it was championing the rights of young people and his desire that they should be out and about with the Duke of Edinburgh scheme, and of course environmentalism, well before it was fashionable, well before any of us were talking about things like climate change. He was talking about that. So he in his way reflected this very turbulent era that he lived through and that he and the Queen lived through as well.
And if you look at his early life, very turbulent, very disrupted early life in his childhood, born on Corfu, and then difficult family circumstances. In many ways, it was this country and his education here that gave him some stability.
It gave him stability, the education here. It gave him a remarkable philosophy about the primacy of the individual, and this at a time when totalitarian regimes were taking over Europe, and he was taught that the individual was key. Yes, teamwork was important, but the individual was so important. It also highlights one of the great contradictions of his life, that here is a man who spoke very frequently throughout the 50s, 60s and 70s, hundreds of speeches, all of which he wrote himself, about how important the individual was. And yet, of course, he subsumed his individuality into the royal family and into national service. But as you say, an extraordinary, turbulent early life. And then finding a home in Britain, serving the country in the Second World War in the Royal Navy, and then almost becoming part of the country by joining the royal family. And this extensive period of service, a kind of service perhaps that we can't really imagine anymore, in the way that he sacrificed so much of his life to give service to the royal family and to the nation.
Do we know that there were times when he struggled with his role, or perhaps we should say his lack of role?
Certainly. I mean, he struggled at an individual level. I mean, when there was the issue of whether or not his offspring would bear his name, of course they don't. They bear the name of Windsor, most of them. And he certainly struggled when he joined the palace, which he found a very restrictive place, a very difficult place, which, as we heard earlier, he sought to modernise. But he found himself in extraordinary difficulties with the palace, found himself slapped down and criticised by a very large number of people. And his response was to pour himself into charities and charitable acts and the new projects that he set up, like the Duke of Edinburgh Awards scheme, which has seen hundreds of thousands of people pass through its hands. This constant whir of activity that perhaps left rather a small amount of time for himself. For a very private man, he lived his life in these extraordinary array of public roles. So it was a life of extraordinary energy, but also a life of contradictions and a life that reflected the long, long and turbulent decades lived through.
For the moment, Johnny. Thank you, Johnny Diamond.
Just a reminder, it's 14 minutes to 1. You're listening to BBC News. We've interrupted all the schedules on BBC Radio as we report on and reflect on the news from Buckingham Palace. The announcement of the death of His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. A lot of reaction coming in now. I see the Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison, has issued a statement. I won't read it all. It's quite a few paragraphs. But through his service to the Commonwealth, he presided as a patron of nearly 50 organisations in Australia. Given his own service, Prince Philip also had a strong connection with the Australian Defence Force, says the Prime Minister. And for 65 years, the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme has encouraged over 775,000 young Australians to explore their leadership potential. Australians send our love and deepest condolences to Her Majesty and all the royal family. That from Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister. Let's hear just a little bit more of Prince Philip in his own words now. We've played a couple of clips of him and about really bringing home the degree to which he has spanned different eras. After leaving school at 18, he wanted to become a fighter pilot. The family tradition saw him join the Royal Navy. He distinguished himself in the Second World War, as we've heard, including being mentioned in dispatches for his role as the searchlight officer in the Battle of Cape Matapan, at which the British guns inflicted a heavy defeat on the Italian fleet. 70 years later, he reflected on that night.
I don't think Cunningham set out to have a night battle. He just decided that he'd go on until he could find the Italians. Fact is that we found them in the middle of the night was pure chance. The interesting thing that struck me was that it was so close that, you know, those big searchlights, colossal great things, it only lit up half one of the Italian cruisers. And they said, train left. Well, I hadn't seen another one, but anyway, we found the other one, and it lit up the middle part of it. Whereupon it practically disappeared instantly under a salvo of 15-inch shells at point-blank range.
Well, Prince Philip was detailed to accompany the 13-year-old Princess Elizabeth, his third cousin, when she came with her father on an official visit to Dartmouth Naval College, where he was training as a cadet. They kept in touch during the Second World War, and the Prince spent Christmas at Windsor Castle in 1943. The palace announced their engagement in July 1947, and their wedding that November was seen by many as a welcome splash of colour in the grey austerity of post-war Britain.
I, Philip, will become your liege man of life and limb, and of earthly worship. Faith and truth I will bear unto you, to live and die against all manner of folk, so help me
God. A little bit of the life of Prince Philip. Let me talk to Robert Hardman again, royal biographer, on the line for us. Robert, why don't you talk to us a little about the changing role and nature of the royal family? I mean, listening to just how different it all was then from the way the royal family is talked about in public life now. It is an extraordinary evolution that has occurred.
Yes, in the same way that the Queen has reigned longer than any monarch in our history, there has been Prince Philip right through that, helping the institution adapt. I mean, if we look back to the start of her reign, we were still immersed in the the Korean War. The Cold War was just beginning. Britain was still on rations. This was still very much a monocultural, church-going nation, covered in scars from the Second World War. Most people didn't own a car or a television, and he has been at her side and very much helped to bring the monarchy up to speed with all the change that's happened since, right through the jet age, the space age, into the digital age. Here's the man who had one of the very first computers in Britain, who installed some of the very first solar panels in Britain. He was the first member of the royal family to do a television interview, or indeed to go to places like the Soviet Union. With many of his organizations, he was this sort of pathfinder for the monarchy. He was this extraordinary adventurer in many ways. He went to the first member of the royal family to go to Antarctica. Nothing was really beyond him. He was fascinated by science, by innovation. He hadn't been to university, but he would end up as a very dynamic chancellor of 4 universities. In everything he touched, really, he did with enthusiasm. He hated being a sort of symbolic token presence. If he was going to get involved in something, he really was going to get stuck in. And we just heard that statement from the Prime Minister of Australia. Let's not forget the Queen is head of state of 15 other nations. They will all, in their own way, have their own very fond, very personal memories of the Duke, because wherever she went, he went. And he has visited even more countries than the Queen. In some of those early years when she was a young mother, she couldn't get away. For example, 1956, she's due to open the Olympics in Australia. She couldn't get there. She sent Prince Philip. And all over the world, there will be people today just reflecting on these extraordinary memories they have of this vital young times, obviously, and over time, became a elder statesman of the royal family, and everyone, I think, will have their stories. And I think, after the initial shock and the initial sadness has passed, I very much hope there'll be a celebration of all that this extraordinary man has done, not just for this country, but really for the world.
Robert, thank you for that. Lord Charteris, the former private secretary, wants to recall Prince Philip is the only man in the world who treats the Queen simply as another human being.
Well, on the line now is Robert Lacey, biographer and historian who's been writing about the Queen for 40 years. Afternoon, Robert.
Hello, Mishal.
How would you characterise his role, his importance, his influence in the way that she carried out her public duties?
Well, as we just heard, I'm not sure who said it, Lord Charteris said that he was the only man in the world who could treat the Queen as an ordinary person. That's true, of course, and he would have been struck by that as her private secretary. But one of the remarkable things about him was the awe and reverence and respect he had for her, at the same time as being this, in some senses, apparently wonderfully casual husband. I mean, he set a whole style, and I think everybody who's reflecting on this at the moment will have a very sudden, solid new feeling of this royal family. It is as if a member of our family has gone. Here we are as experts trying to analyse what he gave to the Queen. He gave something to all of us, didn't he? The Queen, conservative with a small c, steady, and there was Prince Philip beside her. It is just impossible to imagine, very difficult to imagine, what life will be like without him.
She described him, didn't she, on their golden wedding anniversary as her strength and stay all these years, and that expressing the sentiment that she, the family, and this country and other countries owed him a great debt.
Yes, and that's absolutely the case. If one looks back at her reign analytically, at all the big moves and changes that happened in the monarchy, they all came from him. And let's not forget that when she came to the throne, she was a Windsor. And now, as he leaves us, the royal family has a new name. It's Mountbatten Windsor, and it will go on being Mountbatten Windsor. All their descendants will reflect the incredible role that he played, and which clearly the Queen wanted him to play and wanted him to get proper credit for. I mean, sometimes people talk about the difficult early years of the reign, and one of the difficulties was the fact that the government, Winston Churchill and people of that generation, wanted to stick with Windsor right from the beginning. The Queen herself personally wanted to reflect the credit and the importance of this man in her life by changing the royal family name, and eventually in the 60s it became Mountbatten Windsor, and it will now, into the foreseeable future, reflect his name and everything he's given to the monarchy and to national life.
How do you think he saw his role, and what was his template? You could imagine it might be Prince Albert, but of course that was a very different time, and he had a formal constitutional position as Prince Consort.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Prince Albert, because of course Prince Albert, with Queen Victoria, really invented the modern representative monarchy that we have in the 1840s. And without getting into too much of a history lesson, this was the time when monarchy around Europe was under threat. And this husband and wife team, so similar to the husband and wife team we've experienced in our lifetimes, come up with this new model of monarchy. There's mad King George III, there's the decadent Hanoverians. What can we put in its place? Family life. What role can the monarchy play in a society where actually there are elected politicians to do the running of the country? Well, they came up with the idea of a representative family that would stand for the things that everybody agreed on, our hopes, our values. And that is the contribution that Prince Philip brought especially to the life of the Queen and the reign of the Queen, her sense of duty and absolute dedication. And then he's the man bringing in the new ideas, the fresh initiatives, and modernizing the monarchy, but always keeping it in tone and in touch with the life of the nation as a whole.
A reformer of the institution. You certainly had that sense of that in the 60s, didn't you? But in more recent years, do you think that the pace of public life, the scrutiny of public life more recently was difficult for him?
No, I don't think so. I may be emotional about it. We're at this moment. I can't think of any negatives, really. I mean, and how funny that, one can't even imagine that he retired. I mean, he even if the pace of the new initiatives he brought into the monarchy slowed down, and the initiatives perhaps were taken over by Prince Charles, and now, of course, so dramatically by Prince William, who always reminds me very much of Prince Philip. When I see him standing there, you can see Prince Philip's blood and style in the style of Prince William, and his emotional presence and strength to the whole royal family. I mean, I'm sure, one's speculating here, but it's not speculating. We know that everyone in the family was so looking forward to his 100th birthday this summer.
Yes, and only a short time since he came out of hospital.
Exactly. I remember interviewing him back in the 1960s, and I say this only because I was just embarking on my first book about the royal family, and he was the person that people like me got sent to explain what was going on, to try and provide and put into words the rationale behind what was happening, and he did it very well. He was a bit intimidating, especially for a young journalist whose hair was too long. But that's enough from me. Thank you very much.
Well, we will come back to you, I'm sure, later on. Robert Lacey, biographer and historian, thank you very much.
Lots of reaction to the death of Prince Philip coming in. Special programming across BBC networks will stay on air to reflect the news that we've heard today.